Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to the Data Colada Seminar Series. Today, our speaker is Alice Moon from the University of Pennsylvania, and we're joined by a really tremendous set of panelists for today, including Kate Baraz, Yannis Evangelidis, Mina Jung, Ellie Kyung, and John McCoy. In addition, of course, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson will both be here as well. Really looking forward to the presentation. You can submit questions and comments to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will hopefully get a chance to get to them, but even if we don't worry, they will eventually get their way to Alice after the presentation is over. And so with that, I'm going to give the floor to Alice, and she can talk us through her research. Thank you, Alice.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my slides. Cool. Can you see everything? Looking good? Great. Thank you all for joining this talk. Before I get started, I just first wanted to thank all the panelists for being here. I'm really excited to hear your questions and your feedback. And also thanks to the Data Colada team, Leif, Joe, and Yuri for organizing the seminar series. I've been really enjoying all the talks so far, and I'm excited to be here. Today, I'm going to be presenting a paper with my co-authors, Mina and Leif, who are both on the panel, on what we call the overestimation bias. And this is one in which people believe that others have more intense experiences than they do themselves. I'm going to get into how relying on intuitive representations can lead us to this bias, and also some paradoxical consequences of relying on this intuition. Oops. Okay, to get started, I'm going to ask you to imagine a trip to Paris. And just to make this example a bit simpler, let's also imagine that it's in a beautiful pre-COVID world. And probably you're picturing something like this. And if I were to ask you, how much would you like this trip? You'd probably think of a lot of positive things about it. After all, a trip to Paris is generally considered a positive experience. So you might think about the beautiful scenery from the Eiffel Tower, a trip to the Louvre Museum that you might take, and if you're like me, all the wine and cheese you're going to have, so on and so forth. But at the same time, you'd also probably consider some other negative realities. So your French might not be very good, so you might worry that it might be difficult to get around. If you're like me, you might hate cigarette smoke, which is more prevalent there. Also, Paris is super crowded, and anytime you want to go see things, there's usually a crazy line to get through. So your liking for this trip might still be positive, but somewhat more moderate than what people's general representations of this trip might be. Now, on the other hand, if I were to instead ask you how much someone else might like this trip, a lot of those negative realities might fade away. So maybe these other people don't have the same concerns as you might. So maybe they speak fluent French, or they're fine with crowds, or they don't mind cigarette smoke. It's kind of hard to predict what idiosyncratic things that you dislike about this positive experience might carry over for others. So when you consider how much someone else might like this trip, you might assume they'd like it quite a bit, given that the general intuitive, what I'm going to call core representation of the experience is positive. So our account is that we're aware of both the positive and negative attributes for our own valuations and preferences, but we're less aware of these for others. So instead, our predictions for others rely more on the core representation of the experience, which is intuitive, so that a trip to Paris is enjoyable. And what I mean by core representation is essentially you're going to use the most probable or intuitively compelling representation within the category of the experience. So for that trip to Paris, for instance, people don't really know how much others actually like or value it. So they rely on the prototype of what that experience is generally like. So you think of the trip to Paris that's enjoyable because most of them usually are. And you're going to ignore ones that aren't intuitively compelling, like that unenjoyable Paris trip. And relying on those core representations is going to make these judgments easier, but also more prone to error, because they're going to ignore the broader distribution of experiences. So they're more unidimensional, which leads to this systematic bias. So again, when you're considering that trip to Paris, you're going to tend to think that others would evaluate it in a more uniformly positive way based on these core representations. And that'll lead you to assume that others would like the experience more and value it higher. So is it the case that others actually like these positive experiences more? So looking at the literature, there's some evidence that's relevant to our theory, and probably the most relevant finding is one that was first documented by Shane Frederick, in which he found that people think that others are willing to pay more for the same products. And this is a pretty robust and pervasive effect, and it's also consistent with our account. But based on our theory, we wanted to test whether this was a broader phenomenon than willingness to pay. So maybe people think others just more broadly like products and experiences more. So we've looked at a ton of things in this paper. There are like 25 studies across the main text and the supplemental materials. So even though I don't know that we understand everything perfectly, we've at least really tried to understand this phenomenon. And for everyone's sake, I'm just going to present a subset of these studies. The study numbers aren't the same as in the paper, but at the bottom of the slides, I'm going to reference the study number that's in the paper as well. And as I mentioned, I'm going to start with this idea that maybe people more generally think that others like products more than they themselves do. I'll really establish that effect, and then I'm going to get into some tests of mechanism and implications.
Sorry, Alice.
Yeah.
Quick question to test understanding. Is the claim that others, is the claim about liking or about experiencing more intensely? So take negative events, like, I don't know, going to the dentist. Does your theory predict that other people like that less than I will? Or more than I will?
That's perfect. I'm going to get to that, I believe, in study 4, but yes. So based on this core representation thing, you're exactly right. So people should be experiencing things more intensely when you think about negative experiences, because the core representation for a negative experience should be negative. So you'll rely on that, but for yourself, it's going to be more nuanced. So again, you're going to think that other people dislike those more also. Cool. Thanks.
Alice, I have a question as well.
Yeah,
I guess from a theoretical perspective, like how do you see your work as kind of like in the context of work with construal level theory? So construal level theory would predict, when things are more distant, so if it's like socially distanced others, then you would kind of see things in terms of more of the gist of the experience, maybe not consider some of those details. So do you see this as complementary or different in some ways? Or for example, like, would you predict the same thing would happen if you made the same prediction for yourself in the distant future as opposed to the near future?
Great. So I think there are a couple of things. The first is that for something that is for other people, essentially what you're doing is using a heuristic. In that way, maybe you're thinking of others in this more abstract way, and for yourself, you have more of an understanding of how you're liking something and things like that. The other part to it is when you're thinking about yourself in a distant future, a lot of these are kind of more, the products are a little bit more in terms of things that you are considering for future consumption. We see it for both something that's more abstract and also for more specific experiences. I haven't really thought as much about in terms of what maybe other people might be thinking in terms of the construal level part, but let me think about that a little bit more and get back to you in a second. Okay, thanks. Okay, so in study 1, we tried to test this idea in the field. So we collected data at a local movie theater in Oakland, California, on multiple Wednesdays, which was a weekly pay what you want day at this theater, in which people could pay what they wanted with 20% of their payment going to charity. By the way, pay what you want is not the same as willingness to pay, but is incentive compatible, and more importantly, it works similarly on the dimension we want, which is that when people value something more, they pay more in this payment structure also. So when customers arrived, one person from every group completed a quick survey where they indicated which movie they were watching and the number of people in the group. And importantly, we embedded a couple of measures of interest. The first was self-payment, which is how much they thought they would pay per person for the movie. The other was other payments, so how much they thought another customer would pay per person for the movie. And most importantly, a measure of how much they would like the movie. So we operationalized this as enjoyment, so how much they thought they would enjoy the movie on a 7-point scale, and also how much they thought another customer would enjoy that movie on a 7-point scale. So self-payment and other payment was within subject, and other enjoyment was between subjects. We also did some counterbalancing of the order of these questions. Before I get into the results, I just wanted to make a quick side comment here, which is that willingness to pay is always noisy. So we deal with this in a somewhat complex way. It's all laid out in the paper, so I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but I'm happy to discuss with everyone offline. The short of it, though, is that the effect seems to be robust to other ways of looking at the data. And also, our main hypothesis isn't about payment per se, but also to show that the overestimation of others' preferences is broader than payment. Okay, so what did we find? First, we replicated past research that people think others are willing to pay more for this movie than they themselves would. And I think this is still pretty cool to see that this replicates even in the field and with this pay what you want structure. But more importantly, is this broader than payment? So will we see the same effect for enjoyment? And indeed, we found that this bias persisted with the enjoyment measures as well. So we had initial evidence that maybe this was a broader phenomenon than just payment, but something about valuations and preferences. And I'm going to refer to this as the overestimation bias just for shorthand. Oh, one other thing that you might have noticed is that the size of the effect is about the same for willingness to pay and enjoyment in this particular study, but it's not always the case throughout our studies. So often it's larger for willingness to pay, sometimes it's larger for enjoyment, but importantly, it seems to be robust either way. So in study 2, we wanted to see if this overestimation bias was robust to other contexts and products. So we investigated whether this overestimation persisted with different categories of products. And of course, it's impossible to sample every type of product, but we try to think of products that would vary on 3 dimensions that we thought would be important, which were whether it was utilitarian or hedonic, expensive or inexpensive, and whether the prices were easier or harder to guess. We again looked at movie ticket to test this out in the lab as well, but we also included 7 other products to get at these different dimensions. So personal limo driver, for instance, would be expensive, hedonic, and relatively easier or more difficult to guess what the price would be. And tube of toothpaste would be inexpensive, utilitarian, and relatively easier to predict how much it would be. So the design of the study was that people either evaluated for themselves or another person, and people were either asked about willingness to pay or enjoyment on a 101-point scale from 0 to 100. Okay, willingness to pay is going to be on the y-axis, and the blue bars will be for self, and the green bars are estimates for others. And again, we replicated previous research on overestimation on payment. People generally thought others would pay more for products than they themselves would, so the green bars are generally higher than the blue bars. Some products are stronger than others, but looking at everything overall, there seems to be overestimation of others' payments.
Alice?
Yeah.
Sorry, I am a co-author, but I'm going to ask this question only of you because I haven't thought about it. If we look across all of the products, again, as you point out, some effects are bigger than others. Do you have intuitions for what would predict big effects versus what would predict smaller effects? Like what are the attributes of a product or experience that seem?
Yeah, so as you know, we've tested so many different types of products. Generally, I feel like there hasn't been any systematic difference in terms of any of the characteristics that we can think of. It is the case that there are ones that work more strongly than others, and we'll see that even with the enjoyment. But I don't think we've seen anything in particular that seems to explain why one type of product might work better than others. Like for instance, even with like the cheaper and the more expensive products, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference there. That would have been one that I would have thought also. The only thing that I'll mention is that there are also mixed products, like ones where you might not be able to think of what the core representation might be, and those kind of have wonky effects. Yeah, so maybe for those, people don't really know, like for a polarizing product, whether that would be a positive core representation or a negative one, and we do see kind of mixed effects there too. Great. Now looking at enjoyment, we generally, again, see a pattern that people think others like products more than they themselves do. Again, there's variation, but there's no systematic difference, as I just said, based on those dimensions that we've tried to vary. For instance, one that I'll note is treadmill. We don't really show the pattern there. If anything, it's kind of opposite. And this kind of gets to Leif's question. It's possible that, for instance, treadmill might be a case where people have like a negative core representation somewhat of that. I'm not entirely sure, but if that's the case, that gets to John's question. I'll return to that later in the talk. But
I had a question, Alice.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, there are two things that could be going on here. It could be that people are thinking about others who generally like the product. So I'm thinking of fans of all these products, or it's that you are thinking of just the positive aspects of the products. And in your opening slides, you kind of focused more on the core representation, which is something about the object, rather than who are the people that come to mind when we answer this question. So I thought whether you have tried to distinguish between the two things. I was thinking of people, different people who like the product versus just focusing on the positive aspects of the product.
Perfect. We actually do try to rule out that account later, and I'll get to that study closer to the end. But the short of it is that we have tried to account for people thinking of like a biased sample of others. So maybe people who just really like the product, and it seems like we don't find evidence for that account. It's possible it's playing into these effects, but even when we control for that, we still see overestimation, which I think is closer to our core representation account. Great. Okay, so we can have greater confidence that this is a robust effect. And given that this was robust, we also wanted to investigate whether people would show this effect when they were asked to directly compare their preferences to that of others. So does this overestimation bias also arise within subjects? So will people explicitly think that others are liking things and valuing them more than we ourselves do? So in study 3, participants evaluated a box of chocolates and were asked to report either willingness to pay or enjoyment for both themselves and another person. Okay, let me orient you to this graph. On the x-axis is self-willingness to pay, on the y is other willingness to pay. Each dot is going to be an observation, and bigger dots just mean that there are more observations at that point. And the color of the dots are going to show you how they're comparing themselves to others. So the red dots mean that you think other people would pay more than you yourself would. Green dots, you're equal. And the blue dots will be, you think that self would pay more than other. So first, this is a pretty graph, but there are also more red dots than blue dots, as you would notice. That's kind of overestimation. But importantly, what I want you to get from this is that at every level of willingness to pay, you're still seeing some type of overestimation. So you're seeing that there are more red dots than blue dots across the spectrum. It's not just for people who would pay very little themselves. Okay, and this is for enjoyment. The same pattern arises. It's kind of hard to tell because the graph looks a little bit different. Part of that is because the effect's a little bit smaller here. And also you'll notice that really large green dot at 100 and 100. And that I think is people just saying like, duh, I love chocolate and everyone else loves chocolate. But I think overall the results essentially say the same thing as willingness to pay, which is that even within subjects, overestimation is happening for enjoyment also. And we see this again for all of the different levels of enjoyment. Great. So now that we've established that people more broadly think others like and value things more, I'm going to tackle this explanation of ours. And we're getting into some of the studies that other people have asked about so far. So far, we've only looked at experiences when the core representations of those experiences should generally be positive, but our hypothesis suggests that people should have more intense experiences because they're relying on these core representations. So when they consider negative experiences, the core representation for these should also be negative. So people should think others would also dislike negative experiences more. But on the other hand, based on the evidence I've presented so far, you could have an alternative hypothesis that maybe people generally think others are just more positive about experiences and just like all of them more than you do. So maybe everyone loves things and you're just a hater. So even for negative experiences, people should think others like them more or dislike them less. So in the next study, we decided to test this with negative experiences. And in study 4, we asked people either about their willingness to pay to avoid or their disliking for negative experiences. And there were 8 negative experiences that we took from the Frederick 2012 paper, like eating 4 hard-boiled eggs over 15 minutes, or walking around your neighborhood with a Repent t-shirt on. Negative experiences, again, should have a negative core representation, just like John kind of previewed. So if our account were to bear out, we'd find that people also think others would pay more to avoid these experiences and dislike them more than they themselves would. So y-axes are now going to be willingness to pay to avoid. Blue bars are again for self, green bars for others. And again, our theorizing would predict that we should see others would say that they'd be willing to pay more for to avoid these negative experiences than the self would. So the green bars should again be higher than the blue bars. And that's exactly what we see. So consistent with our account, people thought others would pay more to avoid these negative experiences. And when looking at the dislike, people also thought they'd also generally dislike these negative experiences more than they themselves would. Okay, now we can say that people think others experience things more intensely than they themselves do. And we think this is because people are considering these core representations when judging others' preferences. But for our own preferences, they're more nuanced. So returning to that trip to Paris, for instance, we think others will just like it, but our own liking will be more moderate because we're also considering things that we might not like about it. So like most experiences, that trip to Paris is going to have both positives, which are consistent with the core representation, and negatives, which are going to be inconsistent with the core representation. But what if instead we considered a more uniformly valenced experience? So one that was, for instance, more unambiguously positive. In that case, the overestimation bias should be attenuated because for the self, now you don't have those things that are counter to that core representation to consider, and they're going to be both the self-liking and the other liking should be pretty similar. So in study 5A, we decided to test that by asking people how much they would like one of 2 prospects, either a mixed experience or a more uniformly valenced experience. By the way, shout out to Josh Lewis for suggesting this brilliant study. So participants rated how much they or others would like either a gamble, which was the mixed experience, so a 50% chance of winning $500. So you could have that positive winning or disappointment. And the uniformly positive experience was a pure win, which was the experience of winning $500. So this should just be positive. So based on our hypotheses, we should expect the overestimation for that gamble, but this should be attenuated with the pure win because both self and other liking should be more consistent with that core representation of the experience, which is just positive. And for that gamble, people did show the overestimation bias. So people thought that other people would like it more than they themselves would. But more importantly, this was significantly attenuated with that pure win, that uniformly valenced experience.
Alice, could this be a ceiling effect of sorts? Right.
Perfect. Just teeing it up. Yeah, so we decided to replicate that and change the stimuli slightly. So instead of $500, we changed it to $10 and lowered the amount. And we had the same pattern. We saw the same pattern at least. So this time there was a significant difference. So it could have been partly ceiling effect. But because again, for that pure win, you're also seeing other people liking it more than themselves. But importantly, there was that significant attenuation. So it was a significantly smaller effect with that pure win. So I think that supports our theorizing because, again, I've been saying the reason people think others like this positive experience more than they do is because they're relying on the core representation for others, but our own experiences are more nuanced. But when we have people consider the experience that's unambiguously positive, just winning money, now self-liking should not be so nuanced, so it seems to be pretty positive also, and that's what we're seeing here.
Alice, oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Kate.
So a question about that representation. So it could be the case that I'm just not thinking about the disappointment of losing the mixed gamble when I'm thinking about someone else, or it could be that I'm saying that person won't mind losing. So it could be like the number of attributes are like, I think that they're fine being disappointed. Do you have a sense for which one it is? I think this also relates to Ellie's earlier question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it could be either. Our account would just say that you're focusing mainly on the positive, like, so partly because this has a positive expected value, right? So you're mainly thinking of it as a positive thing, but for yourself, you're also considering, hey, I could lose this gamble. So in that case, I think people are just mainly focusing on it being a positive expected value for this gamble. And that's kind of what's leading to this.
So do you think if you showed them, just to follow up, if you showed them 5 of the attributes, like all 5 of the ones that you're thinking about, and you made it salient, like they might lose the gamble and might be disappointed, would it turn off the effect, do you think?
I think it could, in that even for others, people understand if you force them to consider like negatives, then they will, right? And actually we're gonna kind of get into that in a little bit. So if you force them to think of negative things, then they are able to understand that other people might dislike something, but without that, they just rely on this intuition that they'll just like something like this gamble because it seems positive overall. Cool.
I think related to Kate's question. So do you expect that, or have you collected data on when the other is more similar or different from you? So if they're more similar to you, you're more likely to consider the things that you would consider for yourself. Whereas if it's somebody very dissimilar from you, then you're more likely to kind of rely on these core representations.
That's a great question. I'm going to put a pin in it for just like 2 seconds because that's pretty much the next study.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, great.
Sorry, Alice, before you go on, why do you think you get an effect at all for the pure win condition? I mean, it seems like your theory should say that you're going to see no difference between self and other for pure win. So why is there this small effect? Do you think there's something additional going on?
That's a great question. I don't 100% know why we have this effect. It's possible that maybe because this liking scale is kind of just, subjective from not at all to extremely. Maybe they are thinking about something else. Like for instance, they might be thinking about winning $10 versus winning like that $500 or something like that. So it could be then they're starting to think that that's not enough. Maybe that could be explaining it, but I don't have a full understanding of why this this difference might have occurred for this particular experience. Because you're right, it is just positive, and they should be just thinking about the positives. But if they're thinking about a negative, that's the only one that I can think of right now. Yeah.
I wanted to.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just typing the answers, very busy. So there's one question that that came up. Maybe you could answer that they could be relevant to studies. Quentin Andre asked, from the theory, one might predict that when the prototype is blurrier, most people do not have a strong core representation of the experience, or there is strong heterogeneity in the features of the core experience across people. The effect would be weaker. Do you have data on this?
That's a great question. We do have some, like a little bit of data on this. Ones where either, again, I slightly briefly alluded to this, but mixed experiences or polarized experiences, those you might not really know what your core representation is. For example, we tested MAGA hat, and there we kind of had weird responses. Part of it might have been the sample that we asked. We did that one at Wharton Behavioral Lab, and we asked about other participants, so they might have like some inferences about who the other people might be in that sample. But long story short, I think that if you consider ones where the prototype is kind of hazier, as Quentin's saying, then it seems to kind of attenuate the effects a little bit, as he's suggesting also. Okay, so we're finding more and more support for our theory, but there's one nagging alternative explanation that I wanted to address, and this gets to Ellie's point. Again, we think that overestimation bias is occurring because people are relying on these core representations to judge others' preferences, but an alternative explanation is that maybe it's because people should be relying on a biased sample of others instead. So instead of what they're considering, it's an explanation that says it's who they're considering. So let me flesh this out a little bit, and I'm going to get to what Ellie was suggesting also. So for instance, when we ask people how much another person would like a bottle of wine, we want them to be thinking about someone who's an average wine liker. So we want them to be thinking of this person, but they might instead be considering this person. So a prototypical wine liker, so someone who really likes wine and buys it all the time, rather than this average other. So this alternative explanation says that it's not that people are relying on the core representation of the product or experience, as we argue, but instead they're judging for a biased sample of others. So it's changing which part is prototypical. Is it the way that the experience is seen, or is it that the other they're considering is a prototypical other who just likes the product or experience a lot? So if that's the case, if it's this prototypical other explanation, we can fix this by giving them information about these others to just kind of remove the possibility of them thinking of a person who just likes things more than them. So we can give them a reference point that should be pretty easy to understand, which is themselves. So we're telling these people that the other person they should consider is similar to them. So we ask them one of two things. So think of someone who would enjoy this bottle of wine exactly as much as you. How much do you think that person would be willing to pay for the bottle of wine? Or think of someone who would be willing to pay exactly as much as you for this bottle of wine. How much do you think that person would enjoy the bottle of wine? So this gets to Ellie's point, because now they're considering a similar other, but they're similar exactly on a dimension of liking or payment. So this preference and valuation part. So if the overestimation effect arises because of this consideration of this prototypical other, then considering this other person who's similar to them should eliminate the effect. But if instead we find the overestimation bias here, then we should say that it's not just occurring because they're thinking of someone who likes it more than they do. So in study 6, we attempted to test this alternative by doing exactly that. So participants evaluated a box of chocolates for both themselves and another person that was either matched on willingness to pay or enjoyment. So the matched willingness to pay condition, they were asked, how much are you willing to pay for a 12-piece box of Godiva chocolatier signature chocolate truffles? So they might say $30 here. Then they were asked how much they'd enjoy that box of chocolates. And let's say that they say 76. Finally, they were asked, consider another participant who's completing the survey who would also be willing to pay that same amount. How much do you think that other person would enjoy that box of chocolates? In the matched enjoyment condition, they saw the same thing as before, but this time they were asked to consider another person who had the same level of enjoyment as them. How much do you think that other person would pay for that box of chocolates? We also included a comprehension check. So only those who understood that they were evaluating someone who would, like it as much as them or pay just as much as them, depending on the condition, those people are the only ones that were included in the analyses. So first, this is the matched willingness to pay condition. So when both self and other would pay the same amount for that box of chocolates, how much would self and other enjoy this box of chocolates? And again, if it's this prototypical other account, then self and other should now look the same. But instead, we found that even when considering others who would pay just as much as they would for that box of chocolates, they also thought those others would enjoy the box of chocolates more. So this seems to rule out that prototypical other account. So people are just applying this overestimation bias, even in this weird case of similar other. So what happens when people consider others matched on enjoyment? Even then, even when they considered others who would like the chocolates as much as them, they thought those others would pay more for it. So they're showing overestimation again. I just want to pause because even though this is exactly what applying the overestimation bias would look like, this is actually paradoxical. So to break that down, in the case of that matched willingness to pay, they're essentially saying, I think that other people are getting more enjoyment for every dollar because when we pay the same amount for the chocolates, I think that they're enjoying it more than I would. So they're getting a better deal than I am in terms of that enjoyment per dollar. But in the case of the matched enjoyment, they're saying, I think that other people are actually getting less enjoyment per dollar than I would because we're getting, let's say, we're both getting 76 on enjoyment. I think that others would pay more for that box of chocolates. So they're getting a worse deal than I would. So depending on which question they're answering, people seem to think that others either get more or less enjoyment per dollar than they themselves would. So people are over-applying the core representation, but why is that happening? Well, the first building
Alice?
Yeah.
Not to disrupt your momentum, but I want to give voice to a couple of questions that we had earlier, and you're not seeing it. Mina is furiously answering all kinds of questions from people, which is kind of great. But this is one that she didn't get to, I think, because it's complicated. So what would you predict about how our effects are related to the endowment effect? It is either as an explanation or I think more tellingly, would you predict when the endowment effect would be larger or smaller as a function of different features, that sort of thing?
That's a good question. I would say that one of the parts of the endowment effect that I think could be relevant, and I think is relevant to the Frederick paper as well, is that perhaps one part of why the endowment effect is happening, and I don't think we would ever claim that we have solved it in any way, is that that when sellers are thinking about how much someone might pay for something, maybe one of the reasons why selling prices might be higher also is because you're assuming that those other people would also pay more for that thing than they actually would. So maybe that could be part of what might be going on there. Yeah. Okay. So returning to this part of it, I just wanted to start with the first building block, which is that when you're considering the preferences and valuations of others, people have a strong general intuition that others like and value products more. That's just the overestimation bias that we've been talking about. But the relationship of enjoyment to dollar doesn't come to mind so intuitively. You don't really think about that in an intuitive way. So even when the information is presented, which is making self and other the same, then that initial intuition is still going to win out, and people still seem to infer that other person would give a more extreme response. So what I mean by that is that they're ignoring that dimension that they're matched on because that's unintuitive, and they're misapplying this intuition that others just like and value things more on the dimension where they're comparing themselves. So they're thinking to themselves, I don't know how to account for someone who would like this as much as I would, but I know generally they would pay more for it. Or I don't know how to account for someone who would pay as much as I would for this, but I know that generally they would like this more than I would. So based on how we're asking the question, it's leading to these inconsistent responses. And Leif, kind of getting to your point, I think that one of the interesting implications is that this suggests that someone who perfectly understands another's enjoyment level will nevertheless be imperfect at setting prices for that person, or that someone who's perfectly able to set prices for that other person will still kind of overestimate the enjoyment of others. Cool. If there are other questions, definitely let me know.
Alice, I have a question. So how does this, so all this stuff is about liking and disliking. Do you have any data on like other kinds of emotions? Like, do people think do people think that others will find an experience more embarrassing than they do? Do people find that others will, you know, be hungrier than they are in a circumstance where they're hungry? You know, that kind of thing. Do you think it would generalize to that?
That's a good question. I think it depends. I mean, I think it depends on what the core representation is and if you have a sense of that for other people, right? So part of it is that I think we focus on core representations in terms of valence just because that's something that people generally have an easy intuition for. I think it could apply in other cases in terms of the heuristics. The hungrier type of stuff reminds me more of also like these empathy gaps and things like that. And there's kind of a more nuanced explanation, which is, you know, you could say this seems a little bit counter to some of the empathy gap stuff, which is a little bit different in that usually it's like when you're thinking about someone who's hungry when you're not hungry, or when you're hungry and other people are not hungry, that type of empathy gap. But outside of that, we do, even for some experiences that seem closer to like if something's embarrassing to you, we do still find that people would be willing to pay, they think others would be willing to pay more to avoid those types of experiences. But we also kind of, and this kind of gets maybe too into the weeds, but we also do find similar things to the past empathy gap stuff, which is that you also think that you would need to be compensated more than other people for those embarrassing events. I think that could be a measure type of issue, so I don't know that we fully understand it, but the short answer that I'll kind of give back to you is that I think if you have a core representation about like embarrassment of an experience, we would theorize that it should occur there too. Cool. So given how robust this overestimation bias is, how do we disrupt people's reliance on this intuitive core representation? So how do we debias them? So one potential way that we could debias people is one that has kind of been alluded to earlier, which is that we could explicitly ask people to consider a wider array of valuations and preferences. So force people to consider people whose preferences are atypical. So people who might dislike wine or chocolate or Paris. So they'll have to consider how the experience itself is heterogeneous if they have to consider these other people as well. So in study 7, we tested this by asking people to estimate a distribution of others' preferences rather than a point estimate of others' preferences. So we had people evaluate a card for any 2 drinks at Starbucks, and people evaluated this both for themselves and others, and people reported either willingness to pay or liking. But importantly, when they evaluated others, they either answered on that same point estimate scale, so they chose what the average rating or payment might be on a scale, or they answered what the entire distribution of others would look like. So let me show you this for willingness to pay, because it's a slightly weirder one. So for self-willingness to pay, they were asked, how much would you be willing to pay for a card for any 2 drinks at Starbucks? And there was a scale from $0 to $10. For others in the point estimate condition, this was similar, but they were asked to consider others. So consider all of the other participants who are completing the survey. On average, how much do you think those others would be willing to pay for this card? And in the distribution condition, instead of using that point estimate, they estimated what percentage of others would choose each dollar amount, and the total had to equal 100%, and we imputed the average based on their responses. Liking was similar to this, but it was just on a scale from 0, not at all, to 10, extremely. So starting with that point estimate, this is essentially a replication of the previous studies. People thought others would pay more for the card than they themselves would. But importantly, this effect was significantly attenuated when people considered that distribution of others. So in this case, considering the distribution eliminated the overestimation of willingness to pay. So thinking about those others who would also pay very little for this card made them think of others' willingness to pay as more similar to their own. For liking, again, point estimate is pretty much a replication. So people thought that others would like this card more than they themselves would. But when considering that distribution of others' liking, the effect was significantly attenuated. This time, again, people still thought that others would like the card more than they themselves would, but this effect was smaller than in the point estimate condition. So I think this, again, lends more evidence for our theory. So if we disrupt this intuition by asking people to consider people who have experiences that are like counter to that core representation, then we see that effect is diminished. So even though in this case, it's not that they're fully debiased. So wrapping up, overall, I showed you that there's this pretty cool general phenomenon that people think others experience everything more intensely than they do in the field, across many products, and both between and within subjects. Our explanation is that when estimating others' valuations and preferences, people are relying on an experience's intuitive core representation. But people over-apply this intuition, and this can lead to paradoxical beliefs about others' valuations and preferences. So based on what dimension they're comparing themselves to others, people are going to tend to assume that others would like and value things more, even when they're explicitly told that those others are similar to themselves. And finally, we found one way to at least somewhat debias people's intuitions, which is to force them to consider others whose experiences don't match their intuitions, so those who don't like a generally positive experience. So thank you to my collaborators, Mina and Leif, and again to the rest of the panelists and organizers, and to everyone for listening. I'm happy to take more questions. Thank you.
Alice, I had a question about whether you've looked at cases when people might start to use their own representations for others. So have you considered, like, I guess I would call them like non-abstract others? So for example, I love the study where you said like somebody who likes the wine just as much as you do, but you think that they're going to pay more. But if you did it like, it's your best friend who likes the wine just as much as you do. Like, at what point might you start to like take your core representation and apply it to other people, or start to see them as being more like yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that if you think of a specific other that you do know, then you don't actually have to rely on your core representation, right? You don't have to rely on just intuition. So if I know something about your preference for wine, then I don't have to think about how do people generally think about wine. I already know whether or not you like it or not. Or I might have a sense from other things you like or dislike. So I think that we would find an attenuated effect there or diminished effect there, partly because they're not relying on any core representation, they're just relying on stuff that they know about you. So I think that would just be a different process, just because you don't have to rely on that core representation. Cool.
Alice, I had a question. So let's say within stimulus, let's say it's a kind of an ambiguous stimulus, going back to Quentin's question. So let's say it's Godiva chocolates and I don't like Godiva. Would you find within your data that people who rate something negatively exhibit this overestimation of the negative disliking, so to say, within the same experience, basically, depending on people's answers, you find some heterogeneity in your data, right? So some people overestimate liking when they think it's positive, and those who think it's a negative thing, they overestimate disliking. So within your data, looking at the heterogeneity of responses and the effect.
I think that is a plausible hypothesis. I don't think that's completely what happens. Like, for instance, let's say that I really hate wine. If I really hated wine, doesn't necessarily mean that my core representation for that is positive, is going to be negative. Like, I know people generally like wine, but I'm just saying that I hate it. So I think people are aware of that too. So I don't think that necessarily if you see someone's self-rating as negative, that means that others has to also be negative, and that you would see the disliking effect. So I think it depends a little bit, but when it is more ambiguous, like I mentioned, I do think that in that case, people do show kind of a weirder effect there.
I love the results, and I love sort of trying to explain it by tying it to sort of knowledge representation and the concept literature. I guess what I'm grappling with a little is what you mean by core representation. And so in part, obviously, folks who study concept, all sorts of theory about what core representation means, exemplars and prototypes and theory. Does sort of your theory depend on a particular notion there of core representation? Or does it say something about what the right notion of core representation is? And then also sort of what's the most direct evidence you have that this is really about, whatever you mean by core representation?
Yeah, so we don't have as much very, very direct evidence, but I will say that I think that when I'm talking about core representation, it's more so along the lines of what you would think of with representativeness heuristic type of stuff, which is that you just have a representation of what this thing might be, and we generally just look at it in terms of valence, again, because it's just easier, but people generally have a sense of whether something is a positive or a negative experience for most people. So I think that's what people are relying on when they're considering, like, what is it that other people are experiencing, just because it's just an easier thing to do. Any other questions?
Well, that was great, Alice. And thanks to all the panelists, really engaging discussion throughout. And appreciate all the audience members who came today and have listened, submitted so many great questions and comments. Alice is going to have a busy afternoon reading through them. So thanks to everybody for coming, and we will be back again next week with Steph Tolley. And thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.